Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Windsor Castle, hosted by King Charles, a city banquet with the Lord Mayor and a Franco-British summit at 10 Downing Street. But this is what mattered to Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
This will show others trying to make the same journey that it will be in vain, and the jobs they've been promised in the UK will no longer exist because of the nationwide crackdown we're delivering.
So, Keir Starmer, hello. You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Now, Keir Starmer agreed a deal with the French President Emmanuel Macron to return migrants arriving in small boats from France. It's a pilot project that's expected to cover around 50 returns per week, though the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, says those numbers haven't been fixed. The French President pointed out that successful implementation is contingent on France being able to return migrants rejected by Britain to the EU countries they first arrived in, according to EU law. Emmanuel Macron says that Brexit supporters sold a lie to Britons regarding immigration.
The response to our problems require cooperation, a European approach, where the populists have often sold you a response which is through nationalist withdrawal. Budgetary, immigration, legal, growth problems of the UK 9 years ago, were they solved by Brexit? Answer no. They're being solved by a government that wants to recommit with its trusted partners in Europe.
So that was Emmanuel Macron speaking through a translator in praise of actually Keir Starmer's government. But the backdrop is more than 21,000 asylum seekers crossing the English Channel so far this year, something Reform UK has focused on.
I don't think this so-called deal will make any difference at all. If we even try to deport people across the Channel, we will run straight into the European Convention on Human Rights. The lawyers will have a field day.
So Nigel Farage there. Well, let's discuss with our foreign policy and defence reporter Ellen Milligan and Bloomberg opinion columnist Lionel Laurent, who's in Paris. Ellen, the issue of migrants is so politically crucial in the UK. Is this Franco-British deal more than just optics?
I think it remains to be seen. I think this pilot of this scheme it's designed to be ramped up over time. But even Keir Starmer said himself in the press conference yesterday, we need to actually see whether it works. And I think it's been heaped in scepticism yesterday and today because the agreement means that France will only accept the return of around 50 migrants per week. To put that into perspective, on July 4th alone this year, 500 migrants crossed the Channel in small boats. So it's a really small proportion. But the argument that Keir Starmer was making was that even though the net numbers will stay the same because a one in, one out deal means that the UK will accept what it describes as migrants applying for asylum through legal routes rather than through crossing the Channel, that this pilot will act as a deterrent for those thinking about crossing the Channel on small boats. And, there was quite strong language from the Prime Minister yesterday that, we want to prove the concept that if you come over by small boat, you will fail and you will be returned to France. So whether this scheme actually breaks this model that Keir Starmer's been trying to break for a year now, we'll find out in the coming months.
Lionel, to you in Paris, this didn't appear like it was a major issue for Emmanuel Macron in the context of this state trip to the UK. How important was this to him to be able to go home and say that he did announce a deal with the UK?
So this is a politically sensitive issue in France for very different reasons. Macron was very clear and wanted to correct the record next to Keir Starmer by telling the British media that this kind of caricatural portrayal of France as the country that's kind of not doing anything, that's encouraging this to happen, and also taking British money and not doing anything with it is unfair and untrue, because France is actually feeling this from the other perspective, which is to say the local towns and the mayors and the politicians there feel like they have become the external border guards of the UK, and they are the ones who are kind of having to also invest and spend on security. And Brexit has made this worse because it's weaponizing an issue that is to do with borders and requires cooperation. Now, the importance of this deal was not obviously for Macron to say it's been done. I think the bigger question is, can France and the UK actually start cooperating and working constructively on it? The EU actually has had a deal like this with Turkey in the past, and you see that actually it can bring numbers down. The question, though, is, does it get political follow-through? Because it still requires political relations to be good between both sides, as with any border. And when those relations fray, then you do get a deterioration in the success of the deal. So obviously a much different and a lower down priority for France. But as we're seeing from local politicians already today and yesterday, who are actually upset at the deal because they feel they're getting a raw deal, it shows you that the politics are quite sensitive on both sides.
That's interesting. So then, Ellen, overall, to this, huge event and days of, as I say, banquets and discussions and summits, how significant do you think this is as a reset for France and Britain? Keir Starmer, very keen to talk about the hard work that he's put in, quiet diplomatic work.
Yeah, it's really interesting what the point just being made as well, because Macron gave this quite emphatic, it was almost like a rant about Brexit and how the public in the UK were in part persuaded to vote for Brexit because they were promised it would bring down migration. And in fact, the very opposite happened. And, entirely valid points about Brexit and migration, and ones that Starmer believes in but feels unable to make in as emphatic way as the French president, because of the political kind of balance that remains 5 years after Brexit. And Macron did that in his speech to Parliament a couple of days ago as well. I mean, beyond the migrant deal, which I think is probably the most interesting to British voters, the UK and France did agree to strengthen their cooperation on nuclear deterrence, so formally declaring a willingness to coordinate their nuclear capabilities in response to any security threat in Europe. They're the only two countries in Europe that have Europe within NATO that have a nuclear deterrent. So that was really interesting, actually. And they are going to order more Storm Shadow cruise missiles as well. And then we saw that announcement on the loan of the biotapestry next year. So I think there have definitely been some wins for both sides on this state visit, but I think this migrant deal shows the limitations of where that can go. As you were saying at the beginning, Macron has made very clear that this migrant deal depends on France's own agreements with other EU nations, and it's France isn't just going to be a dumping ground for the migrants that the UK wants. So there are those limitations there.
Lionel, I wonder from your perspective whether this cooperation on defence and on nuclear deterrence that Ellen just mentioned gives us an idea of perhaps some of the avenues that the UK has to rebuild ties with European neighbours on the continent, because, I mean, France in the Brexit negotiations was one of the toughest when it came to some of the things that Britain wanted in their post-Brexit trade deal. So is this sort of a way for Britain to get back into the hearts, shall we say, of other European capitals?
Yes, maybe not the hearts, definitely the minds. As you were saying, Brexit. I mean, the thing about Brexit, it's interesting that this was maybe seen as a rant from the British side. Macron is kind of keen to make the point on Brexit that the UK, that the story is over, but in a way, Macron kind of prevailed in some areas because it was very important to show that the UK was not going to be a kind of precedent, right? That the UK would not get this incredible deal that would cause other countries to follow. And I think that clearly hasn't happened. And so now France is able to try and with Keir Starmer, who's obviously a very different person to the previous Conservative governments, to try and find a new constructive relationship. And obviously defence is an area of cooperation. I think that the fact that UK did manage to get access to this new EU defence plan is obviously positive for Starmer, and also as the kind of efforts around investing in the defence supply chain it's obviously good for both, because France actually has a trade surplus with the UK. The UK is a very top trading partner for France. So clearly all of these things are good. Let's see on defence and nuclear coordination how far it can go. It's not just migration that's limiting this. It's also very different worldviews. The UK is still clearly NATO first. It's clearly investing still in the special relationship under Donald Trump, and it's not quite ready to let that go. Obviously, France has different priorities and is hoping for a more sovereign and a more geopolitically minded Europe. Let's see how much overlap there can be in those views as the two countries work together. But it's definitely the more constructive side of the relationship.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because also these two leaders come to this gathering, these meetings at very different points politically themselves. You know, with Keir Starmer, he's a year into office. He's had some bumps already along the way. And we're still trying to work out what Starmer wants for his UK administration, what the goal is. You know, does this give hints? Because, you know, Emmanuel Macron in some ways has obviously been in power much longer and perhaps is waning in terms of his political power. Ellen, what does this show us about what this still fairly new UK government wants to do?
There was a really interesting moment in the press conference where you know, it was put to both of them that they are both centrist leaders who are quite beleaguered in different ways. Obviously, Macron's term runs out in a couple of years and he's been beset by domestic issues, and Keir Starmer's only been in office for a year, but also has been beset by rebellions over his welfare reforms, rolling back large parts of the budget that was put in place last year, speculation over his chancellor staying, who was in tears last week. And it was put to them kind of, has Macron given Starmer any advice on how to weather the storm? And it kind of prompted this quite passionate speech almost by Macron, who was talking about, you know, not resorting to populism. And that was echoed by Starmer. You know, he said, you know, he didn't name him, but he was clearly talking about Nigel Farage, that while Starmer himself is coming up with solutions and trying to strike these deals with France over channel crossings, Farage is using it as a media opportunity and just taking photos of the boats rather than doing anything about it. And I think that's where there's like a real kind of, even though that, you know, there's a valid point about kind of slightly differing worldviews, they do have that in common, and they do emphatically believe in that as well. And they are both in a similar position where populism is on the rise, both in the UK and France. Nigel Farage is leads the most popular party in the polls in the UK at the moment. And so I think that was very much on show at this state visit. And I think what will be interesting is if Starmer himself is willing to kind of make that argument more forcefully in the same way that Macron is. He's sometimes not very comfortable with those kind of more kind of political speeches or arguments, and whether we're going to see that more going forward.
Nothing like the French president bringing him out with a bit of rhetorical flourish in the press conference. Ellen Milligan, our Defence and Foreign Affairs reporter, thank you. And to Bloomberg Opinion's Lionel Laurent in Paris, thank you to you both. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock and Harry Black. Our audio engineer was Andrew Gavin. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back next week with more. This is Bloomberg.